Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the week's top political stories. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. We're here to give you the facts so you can form your own opinion. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for being with us. Today, we're learning a little bit about off-cycle elections and some analysis our team has been doing with none other than Polypolitics staff writer, Paul Rader. Welcome back to the show, Paul.
Victoria, it is so good to see you again.
I know. I'm excited to actually have you talk about something you're very familiar with. Your expertise is going to really show on this.
I can actually say that I know about this stuff instead of research it beforehand and pretend that I know what I'm talking about.
So, Paul, we've been doing a ton of research internally about election timing over these last few months and are looking forward to sharing a glimpse at some of what we've learned with our listeners today. Can you give us a brief overview of what we've been working on related to off-cycle elections?
Sure can. There have been a bunch of different things that we've worked on, but here are some of the more recent highlights. So we've got the election legislation tracker, and I believe Jarek was the one who came on some episodes ago to talk about that a little bit more. And one of the big things that we track in there is potential changes to the timing of elections. And I've been logging some of those, and there's been quite a few of those in various states. We've also been doing outreach to reporters who have been writing on election timing. The comms team has taken over a lot of that. Josh Altick, our director of research, has been doing a lot of research specifically into school board election timing. I've done a bunch of research into state level election timing and some specific local level election timing, and then just some other more general things like coming up with definitions for off-cycle elections and arguments that people make for and against having these off-cycle elections.
Speaking of definitions, that's probably where we should start. So what exactly is an off-cycle election?
So people have varying definitions of off-cycle elections, so it's really imperative that we came up with our own definition. And for the sake of simplicity, we simply boil it down to those elections that fall on the first Tuesday after the first Monday of even years, because those align with federal elections general contest, and that's usually what people think about in relation to the election cycle. And then that definition doesn't necessarily worry about whether it's primaries or if it's considered a runoff, anything like that. We just say that first Tuesday after the first Monday of November in even years, that's on cycle.
So everything not on that first Tuesday is an off cycle.
Basically, yeah.
Off year is also a political term that's thrown around a lot that's related to off cycle elections. But how are they different, or what's the distinction between the two?
Well, off years just refer to odd numbered years, and off cycle can still be in an even numbered year, but not necessarily in November. So you might have an election that's in May of 2024. It's an even numbered year, but it's not off year because it's not an odd numbered year, but it's still off cycle.
Why have we found this worth studying? Why are we looking into this?
Well, there's several reasons. One, it's actually a very little studied concept, at least relatively to a lot of other concepts in political science. And it does have a big impact on voter turnout. And there's a lot of debate amongst a lot of different interest groups about whether or not off-cycle elections are appropriate for a given set of elections.
I know, just looking at my own work in Texas, where I cover ballot measures, the Texas legislature only meets in odd-numbered years, so ballot measures only end up on odd-numbered year ballots. And if you look at the turnout there, it's about 39 percentage points lower, so about 11% turnout in odd-numbered year ballot measure elections compared to 50% in even-numbered years. Another example of this low voter turnout is in that most recent Chicago mayoral race, where we saw only about 35% of registered voters vote on April 4th, as compared to over 70% for presidential years. So it definitely has an effect on voter turnout. You mentioned a little bit about the arguments for and against off-cycle elections. What do both sides have to say about that?
The most fundamental aspect of the debate is what is better for democracy. Off-cycle opponents or people who don't want off-cycle elections say the higher turnout with the on-cycle elections, those November elections, is more representative of the general population, and we should be striving for that higher turnout. Off-cycle supporters will say it may be lower turnout, but they argue also that it's a more informed electorate. Now, obviously, which side of the aisle you think has a better case. That's for our listeners to decide. But some other off-cycle support arguments is that it insulates local politics from the national political climate and that it mitigates ballot roll-off that comes with those longer ballots in on-cycle elections. And ballot roll-off just refers to the fact that the further down you go on a ballot, the lower that voter participation tends to be. You'd have it governor and president, and those kinds of high offices tend to have most of the participation, whereas the more local elections, like maybe county commission, tends to have less participation,
and
even if it's
measures.
on the same ballot. Yeah, something you're very familiar with.
They call that ballot roll-off, I think is what the term is.
Yeah.
As voters go down the ballot, they tend not to vote as much.
For other off-cycle opponent arguments, they also argue that off-cycle elections increase local administration costs because local governments handle the bulk of actual election administration, and that it increases the influence of certain interest groups as well.
In your analysis, you also went further and broke down off-cycle and on-cycle timing into different categories or distinctions. Can you explain that to our listeners?
Yeah, so another way to look at things is we break it down into 4 year types, and that's based on the fact that presidential term is for 4 years. So we have presidential elections like 2020 and 2024. That's self-explanatory. And then you have midterms, which happen midway between presidential elections. But then you also have the odd years that we break up into a post-presidential odd year and a post-midterm odd year. And again, that's just based on the presidential election cycle. So, I mean, we just go with the post-presidential and post-midterm instead of having it pre-presidential.
So in 2023, we're in a post-midterm odd year, correct?
Correct.
Let's dive into some of the state level offices and how election timing varies there. I know in this year, we're looking at some gubernatorial races in Louisiana and Mississippi. We've got a beautiful map that lays out the differences from state to state that listeners can check out in our show notes. But can you do your best at describing some of those differences that exemplify how much these laws can vary?
Well, I'm trying my best to transmit this map to our listeners' minds. I don't know if it's working out very well. And it is a beautiful map. And that's despite the fact that I had a hand in making it. I'm a big fan of maps, but 48 states have state level elections in at least presidential and midterm years. And so by state level, we're just talking about state executives, state legislature, and or state courts. We're not worrying about local level at this point. The exceptions there are New Jersey and Virginia, which are the two states that have only post-presidential odd year and post-midterm odd year elections. And then you have a bit more unusual cases like Louisiana, Mississippi, New Jersey, and Virginia, who have odd year elections for their state legislatures. And in those states and Kentucky elect state executives in odd years, except for, and you mentioned Louisiana. Louisiana's Public Service Commission is the one state executive in those states that does not actually elect in odd years. They do it in even years. And then you have 3 states that hold their state level elections in presidential, midterm, and post-midterm odd years, and that's Kentucky, Louisiana, and Mississippi. And then Pennsylvania, Washington, and Wisconsin hold all of their elections in all of those year types. So every single year, you're going to see something at the state level in those states.
Do you have any insight into why these states adopted their election timing systems? Or is it like too far back in history and this is just the way they've done it for so long?
Part of it is you go back to what I was talking about earlier with the general arguments that off-cycle opponents or supporters and opponents make. And the supporters, for some of these state level elections, it's just the fact that, at least so the argument goes, is that it insulates these local elections from the national political climate. NPR had a good article about it. Like, for example, Virginia, Louisiana, a lot of those states for their state legislatures, they really go far back into even like the 1800s. I forget the exact years, but those go back pretty far. And a lot of the time, it's just a matter of, they argue that it insulates their state and local politics from the national political climate. That's a big part of it.
Got it. Now, on the local level, you said local election timing can vary a lot from even the state and then obviously the national level. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? From what I understand, local elections are where we see most of the off-cycle elections.
Yeah, local elections are where timing can be all over the place. It's difficult to give exact numbers just because there are so many local governments, but you do have some states where in their constitutions they may say for a specific, or in their statutes they may say a specific set of dates that they can have this election for this type of office in that state. But we've seen some action in recent years where cities have shifted their elections from odd to even years. And to give a hat tip to you and the rest of the ballot measures team, in 2022 we had 11 cities and King County move their elections from odd years to even years through ballot measures that voters voted on. One of those cities is sort of my backyard, St. Petersburg, Florida. And then even before that, we've seen over the past decade or so, we've seen cities like Los Angeles also shift from odd numbered to even numbered years. California in general has seen a pretty decent number of such movements from odd to even yeared elections to better align with the federal elections. And you also have some bills right now that are in various stages of the legislative process. Washington is considering Senate Bill 5723. Right now it's in the committee stage, but it would give cities and towns the freedom to switch their general elections to even numbered years. And then another place, Arkansas, is also talking about amending the date for when an election for school board can be held. And you have a little bit of weirdness with semantics about whether these are primary or general or runoff elections and if and when they are held in November. So it's a lot to sift through, and it gets very murky at the local level.
You just mentioned school boards. In some states, the state law mandates a specific date for those elections. In others, laws allow districts to choose their own election date from a range or a list of allowed dates, or through certain charter provisions. What sort of big picture analysis can we point to that shows how much those rules can differ for school board elections?
Well, a big hat tip to the aforementioned Josh Altick for this research. So in 24 states, we have school board elections that are mostly held off cycle from federal elections. And this includes both off year and off date elections, off date just being outside of November. 10 of those states have school board elections that are mostly held on election dates in November of odd numbered years. And then the other 14 states typically have election dates that are not in November. And then we have 14 states that have mostly on-cycle school board elections, which means they happen with federal elections in November of even-numbered years. Then we have 11 states that either do not have state laws or overwhelmingly common practices that determine a specific school board election date, or they have varying school board election dates. So to put it mildly, there's a ton of variation across those states. And then we also have Hawaii, which has a single appointed school board at the state executive level.
Very fascinating. I feel like this is a good point in the show to really plug our elections calendar. So our listeners don't ever miss an election. They can go on Ballotpedia and type in elections calendar, and they won't ever miss an off year or off cycle or off day, all of the off elections. With that, I'd like to thank you, Paul. It's been a pleasure having you on the show, and we look forward to having you back.
Well, I always enjoy coming back on, and it's good to talk to you, Victoria.
And that is all for this week's episode of On the Ballot. Make sure you don't miss an episode by subscribing, and do us a solid by dropping a review of On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, if you have any questions, comments, or love for Ballotpedia, feel free to send it to us at ontheballot@ballotpedia.org or on Twitter @Ballotpedia. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for listening.